All right, let's dive right into the Supreme Court case, Flowers v. Mississippi. It's, wow, this one is something else. You sent us information on this case, and right off the bat, it jumps out. 6 trials. 6 trials for the same crime. Today, we're going to try to unpack why the Supreme Court ultimately decided to reverse the Mississippi Supreme Court's decision in the 6th trial, which, from what I understand, really hinges on some serious questions about, well, racial discrimination in jury selection.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact that it even got to the U.S. Supreme Court after so many trials, that already tells you something, right? Like this Flowers v. Mississippi case, this is a big deal. And just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the real heart of the issue here is whether or not the prosecutor was kicking potential black jurors off the jury, because of their race. And that goes against some pretty major legal principles.
So let's back up for a second. We've got Curtis Giovanni Flowers, and this guy's been tried not once, not twice, but 6 times for these same murders. To really grasp what the Supreme Court decided in the end, we got to look back, right? I mean, what happened in those earlier trials? So in the first 4 trials, the same prosecutor, Doug Evans, used all 36 of his peremptory strikes to remove African-American jurors. Now, just a quick explainer for anyone listening who's not a legal eagle, peremptory strikes basically mean lawyers can remove potential jurors without having to give a specific reason. But as we'll see, the way these strikes were used in this case is going to become a huge problem. What's really wild is that 2 of those early convictions were actually thrown out because of racial discrimination in how the jury was picked. And another conviction was overturned, but that was because of something the prosecutor did that wasn't about the jury selection. Okay, so now we get to the 6th trial, the one that finally lands in the Supreme Court's lap. And guess what? This time, the prosecutor uses 5 out of his 6 peremptory strikes, again, against African-American jurors. If you add up all 6 trials, the numbers are crazy. 41 out of 42 potential African-American jurors were struck by this one prosecutor. I mean, that's got to raise some eyebrows, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's hard to ignore a statistic like that. And so, when the Supreme Court was looking at this 6th trial, the defense attorneys, they came in strong with some key points. And, all this history we just talked about, it was like the elephant in the room the whole time. One of their biggest arguments was what they called disparate questioning. What they showed was that the prosecutor was grilling the African-American jurors, the ones he ended up striking, with way more questions. We're talking an average of 29 questions per juror. Mm-hmm. Compare that to the white jurors who actually made it onto the jury. They only got like 1.1 questions on average. And that's not just some random difference. I mean, that points to the prosecutor really scrutinizing those black jurors, maybe even looking for any little reason to get rid of them while basically giving the white jurors a free pass.
Yeah, that massive difference in how much they were being questioned makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, what was the prosecutor really thinking? It's almost like he had a magnifying glass on one group and barely even glanced at the other. But it wasn't just the number of questions, right? There were also specific situations the defense kept bringing up.
Exactly. Another big argument they made was about stuff happening outside of the courtroom. Get this. The prosecutor was actually doing investigations on 3 of those African-American potential jurors before the trial even started. And, you guessed it, none of them ended up on the jury. But here's the kicker. They couldn't find any evidence that the prosecutor did the same kind of background checks on any of the white jurors. So the question becomes, why the extra scrutiny and why only for the black potential jurors?
It definitely seems like there were 2 sets of rules in play, right? And then there's Carolyn Wright, juror number 14, and she becomes a real sticking point in the case. The prosecutor said he struck her for a couple of reasons. First, that her wages were supposedly being taken because of a lawsuit by Tardy Furniture, a business connected to one of the victims, and second, because she worked at Walmart with the defendant's father.
But the defense, they fought back hard against those reasons. They pointed out that according to the state court records, Carolyn Wright's wages weren't actually being garnished. It was just a request, not the real deal. That's a pretty big difference. And then, to make their point even stronger, they brought up Pamela Chasteen, juror number 17, a white juror. Chasteen, she knew the victim's daughter from high school, so there was a direct link to the victim's family. But did she get grilled with questions? Was she struck from the jury? Nope. So the defense argued that if the prosecutor was really worried about jurors being biased, wouldn't he have treated these 2 situations the same way?
I mean, the comparison between Wright and Chasteen, it's pretty stark, right? They were both around the same age, both had some college education, and they both said they were okay with the death penalty. So why was one seen as unfit to be a juror while the other one was fine? It's a good question.
It really is. And the defense was basically saying that the reasons given for striking Wright, they just didn't add up. They felt like it was just an excuse, to cover up what was really going on, which was racial bias. And then they brought up another case, Edith Burnside, another black juror who was struck. The prosecutor, once again, he brought up that tardy furniture lawsuit. But here's the thing, Burnside, she actually worked for one of the victims, and the victim had even helped her out during a tough time, like when she was going through a divorce. So if anything, that connection suggests a positive relationship. It makes you wonder, why would that be a reason to strike her from the jury?
So the defense was building a pretty strong case that the reasons for striking these black jurors were not legit, especially when you compare them to how the white jurors in similar situations were treated. They were saying that even if you just looked at the sixth trial, without all the baggage of the first five, there was already enough evidence to show racial bias.
Now, we got to make sure we understand the prosecution side of things, too. They admitted that the history of the case wasn't great, but they insisted that every single one of their strikes in that sixth trial had a real reason, a race-neutral explanation. They argued that the Mississippi Supreme Court, when they decided to uphold the conviction, they were just following the rules set out in Batson v. Kentucky. Now, that's the big Supreme Court case that said you can't use these peremptory strikes to get rid of jurors just because of their race. So the prosecution was saying, hey, we followed the rules, we did everything by the book.
But how did they explain the fact that they kept striking black jurors way more often and that they were questioning them so much more intensely?
Okay, so they said that each of the jurors they struck in that sixth trial, they all had some kind of connection to the defendant or his family, things like working with a relative, being related to them, or even having a close personal relationship. They also said that one juror had lied on a questionnaire. And when it came to Carolyn Wright, they doubled down and said, nope, she really was sued by Tardy Furniture, and she really did work with the defendant's dad. They said all those extra questions about the death penalty, well, that was just them making sure everything was clear because they thought some of the answers on the questionnaires weren't consistent. And importantly, they kept pointing out that the trial judge knew all about the messy history of the case and had said they were going to be watching the jury selection very carefully.
So basically, the prosecution was saying, hold on, each one of these strikes was a separate thing, we had good reasons, and the judge was there to make sure everything was fair. But when they had the oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court, the justices themselves seemed to have a lot of questions about all of this, like a lot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The justices, they were throwing some hardball questions. A lot of what they were getting at was, how much weight should we give to the fact that this prosecutor has been accused of discrimination over and over again? They kept pushing the prosecution on their specific reasons for striking individual black jurors, and they wanted to know, okay, show us how that's different from the white jurors in similar situations. Why were they treated differently? They also questioned whether those reasons given by the prosecutor were really race neutral or just clever ways to hide the real reason. And the fact that there were 6 trials, 6, with the same prosecutor in the same small town, that kept coming up again and again. And then they brought up the bigger picture. What does this do to people's faith in the justice system, after seeing all of this? Even Justice Sotomayor, she jumped in and asked the prosecution, are you really confident in how this case has been handled, given all the problems of the previous trials?
Yeah, the Supreme Court wasn't just looking at this trial in a bubble. The whole history of the case, it was definitely a major factor. So let's try a little thought experiment here. What if there was a 10th seat at the Supreme Court, someone who's heard all the arguments, seen all the evidence, the whole 9 yards? What would their perspective be?
10th chair perspective. All right, so looking back on everything that was said and done in this case, you can't ignore the history. And at the core of it all is this basic idea. Everyone deserves a fair trial, and that means a jury that's impartial, that isn't biased against them because of their race. Now, the prosecution, they tried to explain why they struck those jurors in the 6th trial. But when you look at the bigger picture, when you see how the prosecutor kept striking black potential jurors over and over again, it casts a huge shadow of doubt of the whole thing. It just doesn't look good. And the fact that black jurors were questioned so much more aggressively than the white jurors, even when they had similar connections to the case, it suggests that something else was going on. Something had to do with race. And then you've got those inconsistencies in the reasons given for striking black jurors, like that whole thing about the wage garnishment and how white jurors in similar situations were treated the same way. It really makes you question whether those reasons were the real reasons or just excuses. And let's not forget, this wasn't the first time this prosecutor was accused of discriminating against black jurors. It happened in the previous trials too. So when it got to the 6th trial, Shouldn't everyone have been extra careful to make sure the jury selection was absolutely fair? It seems like they didn't really take that history into account enough, and that really damages the credibility of the verdict. Look, I get it. Each individual strike might have a reason that sounds okay on the surface. But when you look at the pattern, the same thing happening over and over again, especially in this specific case with all its baggage, it's hard not to see a possibility of racial bias influencing who ended up on that jury. At the end of the day, it's not just about whether justice was done, it's also about whether it looks like justice was done. And in this case, that perception of fairness, it's been seriously damaged.
So Flowers v. Mississippi, it really throws a spotlight on how hard it is to guarantee that jury selection is fair and unbiased, especially in cases where there's a history of racial bias allegations. The Supreme Court decided to overturn the Mississippi Supreme Court's decision, and that really emphasizes how important it is to look at the whole picture, not just isolated incidents. You got to consider the history, the context, everything. This deep dive into Flowers v. Mississippi has given us a glimpse into how complicated legal arguments can get and how important the Supreme Court is when it comes to making sure our fundamental rights are protected. So we're going to leave you with some food for thought. What parts of this case really stood out to you? What questions does it raise for you about how juries are selected and how the past can still have an impact on our legal system today? Think about it.